Hi, this is the Korg MS-10 and it's from 1978 or 79. I've had this for more than 20 years and I think my dad got it for me for around $50 at that time, it was probably in the 80s or beginning of the 90s, I'm not sure. When I got this, I was starstruck by at that time, modern digital synthesizers, and I didn't really understand this one. It made sounds, but I never found it really useful. And it took me many, many years before I started getting into the actual patch bay on this side here. I don't think this synthesizer needs so much presentation. You know what it's about, and it's the little brother of the MS-20. In this video, I will focus on the patching of this synthesizer. Patching is a way of connecting circuits in a different way than the normal setup with the knobs. So you can be a bit more flexible and you have some more variations of sounds that you can do. It's not as complex as the MS-20, but it still has some really cool things you can do with it. So let's begin. The first thing I want to show you is how to create a sound that goes on forever. Right now, the synthesizer is set up to a noise sound and a very short envelope, so it has a sort of a thin snare sound. Very classic noise stuff. On this synthesizer, in the envelope section, you do have the hold time, so if you pull that to the maximum, the sound goes on for a longer period of time. And you can combine that with a release and sustain level and stuff, but it's not gonna stay forever. Let's turn that off. So what you can do instead is you can put something like a solid output straight into the VCA and actually bypass the envelope generator. If you look at the arrows here, you can see that the envelope generator here goes into the VCA, but also the initial gain here goes into the VCA. So if we plug something into the VCA, we bypass the envelope generator. And to create something steady, a funny thing is that this modulation wheel here actually has an output here. And that is the 5 volts. That goes into the 5 volts into the initial gain. So if you take a simple patch cable like this, you plug it from the modulation wheel into the initial gain, it still works to play like that, but if you pull up the modulation wheel maximum, that is actually the maximum amplitude you can get. So now you can control the volume, or well, not the volume, but the length of the tone by actually the amplitude of the tone by with the modulation wheel. Pretty cool. Another variation of this is to use a split cable. We unplug this one, and instead we're going to use a split cable, which is mono in one end and 2 monos in the other. That means we can actually split the output of the modulation wheel, which is now unconnected, so it doesn't affect anything. But if we plug the modulation wheel into both the VCA, or the initial gain, and also the cutoff frequency, now we can actually affect both the filter and the amplifier by the modulation wheel. Now, to make this actually affect the filter, you need to change the modulation generator here to use the external input. So we pull that up a little bit, and I also know that you have to make the filter setting up here a little bit lower to make this happen. So if we turn this now, it's going to affect the volume, but also the filter. So you hear here, yes, you hear here. So you hear when I pull this wheel, it actually raises the volume, but also you hear that the filter is turned up higher and letting more frequencies through. And if I pull it down again, it's also going to close the filter. If you never used a split cable before, please try, because you can do some cool things with it. Next thing I will show you is to use another weird output that, well, for me it was weird for a long time. You have this here. It says Rev Out. It goes, there's an arrow from the envelope generator and it goes to the Rev Out. And it's got some weird symbol on here. It actually stands for reversed out. And how's that useful? Well, it actually takes the envelope, but it inverts the voltage. Or reverse it, probably. Let's try it out. Right now, I have changed to a pulse width sound, and I've done a short frequency modulation thing. It's like a crappy laser shot. Pew! So, to show you what the reverse out will do, if you notice that this is actually going from a high frequency to a low frequency. So it starts with a high and then drops to a low. So if I plug this into the reverse out, well, take the output of the reverse out and plug it into the frequency, it will generate the same thing, but backwards. So it goes from a low frequency to a high frequency. So now we have created a Super Mario type of sound, I guess, or what else can you do with a reverse out? Well, I'm gonna show you the modulation of the pulse width. First, actually, I'm gonna to show you some of this. I'm sitting in a very awkward position beside the synthesizer, and it's really hard to use both hands here. So I'm gonna use the first trick of mine to output the modulation wheel into the VCA to create a sound, and that way I don't have to actually press the note down. So right now it's set to the pulse width modification, or pulse width waveform, which means that if I turn the pulse width knob, it will sweep the sound a little bit. Of course, you can use the modulation generator, which is this one. You can change the waveform and also the rate of it here. But this can also be output through this hole. So if we use the output of that one into the pulse width modulation, we now actually gonna do it like that. You hear a sweeping sound. So it basically turns the pulse width knob like that at this rate. Now that's cool enough. I mean, yeah, that's you know, you've affected something and it's automatic. But as you hear, when you press it, it sweeps. So the note is not the same. This note and that note is not the same. So if you instead actually use the reverse out and you hear that the sound is sticking to the envelope. The speed of the envelope is actually generating the same speed of the modulation of the pulse width, which makes every note sound the same. But it does actually sweep the pulse width a little bit, so it's a little bit more fat. Compare that to actually sounds a bit more like the old Commodore 64 sound, the SID sound, which I like. it's time to generate the frequency of the MS-10. You can do that the built-in way by using the modulation generator, which is this group of two knobs here, and also how much you will send into this modulation, or how much the modulation should actually affect the frequency. I still have the modulation wheel plugged into the VCA. So I'll just make it sound like that. So if I pull up the frequency modulation, we now affect the sound by using the modulation here. And you can change the waveform, and you can change the speed. While that is cool and all, you can't really synchronize that to the tempo of your song much. I, for one, like that, so I was happy to find that my Kenton USB solo box that I mainly bought to control this synthesizer via MIDI, since it actually takes MIDI input and it outputs the control voltage and gate signal, so you can actually control this from your DAW. I was happy to find that that also has an auxiliary output. It also generates an LFO that you can set to sync to the MIDI signal, or to the MIDI clock that comes into the box, of course. So I do have a bunch of cables here coming from this box, and this particular cable is the output of the auxiliary 1. Now, the auxiliary 1 is plugged into the frequency, and by doing that, I'm gonna get the signal of the LFO of the external box. So we make this sound. Now we're gonna use the external frequency here. So this is actually the LFO you hear that comes from my Kenton box. As you see, the frequency or the rate in the modulation generator doesn't affect this. Neither does the waveform. But the external modulation knob makes you select how much of the external LFO I want to affect the tone with. And this is now set to 120 BPMs, I think. So what else can you do with an external LFO? Of course, the frequency modulation is cool, but it's, well, you can do cooler things with it. For example, if you take the auxiliary out, which is my Kenton box, put this into the frequency, the cutoff frequency, which is the filter. I can now control the filter in my tempo. I have changed the Kenton USB solo to be, the LFO to be a sawtooth up waveform. And it's going at the tempo of 120. Well, it doesn't really matter. It's just going to the same, it's set to a fourth of a bar. So it's basically the normal beat of a kick. So make this sound. And I'm gonna pull down the frequency a little bit, and then I'm going to use the frequency modulation, or the cutoff frequency modulation from my external LFO. This basically sounds like a sidechain effect. Another LFO from the Kenton USB solo is the sample and hold LFO. So if we keep the auxiliary output into the cutoff frequency here, you hear that it's a random signal of the cutoff frequency. If we now add some resonance to this, and pull down the frequency so it sounds cool. You actually now have some really cool random stuff going on here. And this is actually the type of stuff that you heard in the beginning of the video. Other crazy things you can do is, since I was using the split cable before, the split cable 1 to 2 or 2 to 1. So, before we used the... Sorry, I'm having a cold. Before we used the modulation wheel to affect the amplitude and the cutoff frequency. So, what if we put 2 outputs into 1? So, let's do this. Right now, we just have a... It's just a regular triangle here. Take the output of the modulation generator, the ramp, the triangle sawtooth thing, and the, well, let's do the square pulse as well into the frequency. It's now gonna use both the as you hear, it sweeps the frequency and also has the square pulse in effect. This of course comes from the modulation generator. We unplug the square pulse, it just stays in a normal sweep. But once we plug that in, you actually affect the frequency with 2 different outputs. Plug out, plug out. We remove the... That's just the square. Yeah. Another interesting way to use the split cables is to use the output of... let's see if I can remember this. Well, you output both the noise. Actually, no. I'm gonna split the noise into 2 cables. So we have a pink noise going into the frequency and 1 pink noise going into the external in. That means we're gonna... Well, let's pull everything down first to what you have. It's a normal tone. And you can also hear that on the external signal we get the noise, but the same noise will also affect the frequency. I'm not sure if this is terribly useful, but it's a way of showing that you can actually split one output into 2. And of course we can do the opposite. We take the pink noise and the white noise into the frequency, and you have 2 noise sources going into the frequency. Normal. No, it's not very different. But it is a combined output of noise into the frequency modulation.